Why is smell often called the Cinderella sense so underrated in our culture, especially when so many luxury products such as wine, spirits, and perfume are based on it? Even though dogs have twice the number of scent receptors than humans do, why are we better at detecting wine aromas? What might surprise you about how we perceive the senses of taste and smell? Why is the sense of smell so evocative compared to other senses? How can you train your sense of smell? Why does smelling require much more focus than our other senses? And what is retronasal olfaction and why is it so important when it comes to enjoying wine? In today's episode, you'll hear the stories and tips that answer those questions in our chat with Dr. Johannes Frasnelli, a physician and professor focused on the sense of smell. Do you have a thirst to learn about wine? Do you love stories about wonderfully obsessive people, hauntingly beautiful places, and amusingly awkward social situations? Well, that's the blend here on the Unreserved Wine Talk podcast. I'm your host, Natalie McLean, and each week I share with you unfiltered conversations with celebrities in the wine world, as well as confessions from my own tipsy journey as I write my third book on this subject. I'm so glad you're here. Now pass me that bottle, please, and let's get started. Welcome to Unreserved Wine Talk. By the end of today's episode, you will also discover how our olfactory anatomy and processing of smells work, the difference between taste and flavor and how they work together, how men and women perceive smells differently, how expectations and language can influence our smell perception, whether wine aroma kits actually help to improve our ability to smell and taste wine, the positive changes that can occur in the brains of master sommeliers, how our emotional states influence our ability to perceive scents, the differences in how our brains process wine aromas compared to synthetic scents, how olfactory marketing is used by certain brands to improve their customer experience, why certain smells, especially when it comes to body odor, are taboo, how we influence each other via our body odors, and whether or not we have pheromones, what synesthesia is and how it relates to perception in wine tasting, and the main factors that influence the recovery of a lost sense of smell. Okay, on with the show. After being trained as a physician at the University of Vienna, Austria, Johannes Frasnelli was a visiting scientist in the research labs in Philadelphia, Dresden, Germany, Stockholm, Sweden, and Bozen, Italy. He is currently a professor of human anatomy at the University of Quebec at Trois-Rivières, as well as a regular researcher at the Research Center of Saint-Cœur Hospital in Montreal. His research focuses on the physiology, the psychology, and the pathology of the sense of smell. And he joins us now from his office in Montreal. Welcome, Johannes. It's so great to have you here with us.
Thank you for having me.
All right, great. So before we get into all of these juicy topics, what was your earliest, most memorable sense of smell? Like, how old were you and what was it?
Yeah, I had the chance to grow up in a very beautiful part of the world. I grew up in the north of Italy, in the Dolomites. And I remember that the seasons all came with a very distinct smell. I cannot say this one was the first, but of course we had all the smells around Christmas time, the cloves and cinnamon and so on. And then later on, we would have the different smells that were associated with Carnival. And then we would have the spring with apple flowers and so on. And the whole year round, every month, every season came with a very, very distinct smell. When I go back home now in the different seasons of the year, I can still smell them. And it really brings me back to my childhood.
That's lovely. Very Proustian, as we all know, that beginning of Time lost, remembrance of time lost. I'm sure you've had this put back to you all the time, but it's actually not the taste of the cookie, but the smell of that Madeleine cookie that sets off all his memories. But when did you first become fascinated with the subject of smell, the science of it, to study it?
This is also quite, well, I think interesting story. When I was a student in Vienna, so I moved away from small town Meran in north of Italy and went to study when I was 18 years old, and I went to the big city in Vienna. Vienna has a tradition of having those outdoor markets whole year round. You can get different kinds of foods and vegetables, but also spices. And there's a lot of people from Turkey, from the Middle East that are selling their products there. And this was for me a lot of new smells, a lot of new tastes, and new flavors that I kind of organically learned there. We would go there on Saturday and get our stuff, and it was much cheaper than the rest. And in parallel to that, I did my studies. And at some point, towards the end of my studies, I had the opportunity to do a medical doctoral thesis, which is not at all like a PhD thesis, much smaller. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. And the topic was the sense of smell in people with chronic kidney disease. And I came from the kidney side, actually, but I thought, oh, wow, the sense of smell, we can actually study that too. And all of a sudden, I realized that I'm about to combine that, what's interesting for me in my private life, in my personal life, with what is interesting for me in my professional life. And I started out with that. I did not have the intention to do that for the rest of my life. But then as the year went by, at some point, I realized I am much more interested in the sense of smell than I am interested in medicine. So I went on with that.
So you made a bridge there. That's fascinating. And what's the most surprising thing that you've discovered about our sense of smell in your research so far?
In the very beginning, what I was very surprised about is how little we know about the sense of smell. So this was, I would go back 1999, 2000. And I think over those last 25 years, a lot of things have happened. A lot of things have happened also with the sense of smell. So the first surprising thing is how little we know. And then the next surprising thing was in 2004, when a Nobel Prize was attributed for the discoveries on the sense of smell. That was then also a surprising thing, of course. And later, COVID came around. It was again surprising that the sense of smell is so central in the early screening for the disease and is so heavily affected. And it was also surprising before we talked about COVID is how many people suffer from a smell dysfunction. It's approximately 20%. This is before COVID
Wow.
came around. And then I think the next surprising thing is how little people were aware of that. And then once COVID hit and people would become more aware about it, then it was surprising how interested and fascinated the whole population would get with regards to the sense of smell. So from not knowing anything to being very aware of the importance of the sense of smell.
Yeah, it's been a whole cultural change for sure. And I know in the wine and food worlds, it's become important. I see profiles all the time of a certain chef or sommelier lost their sense of smell due to COVID. Most of them were happy stories in the end. They got it back, but we're going to dive more into sense of smell and disease because that is just fascinating. If there's one myth that you wanted to debunk or dispel about our sense of smell, what would that be?
Well, I think the most central one, and I guess the people listening to us know about that, the most central one is that once we have something in our mouth, we talk about taste, but it's actually not taste. Most of it, what we perceive, it's retronasal olfaction as the odor molecules enter the nasal cavity from the back door through the pharynx, through the throat. And what we can taste with our tongue is sweet, sour, bitter, salty, and umami. And all the rest is actually olfactory perception.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Why do you think smell is underrated? Why, like, sight is I think you've said it or somebody said it in an interview with you. It's the sense of science. It's highly respected. It's cerebral. Why does smell get a bad rap? Is it because it's so animalistic or base?
I think there's definitely something to it. There's a very interesting paper that came out 5, 6 years ago by John McGann. He described there's a myth about us not having a good sense of smell compared to other animals. And I think we're going to talk about that later. But this has its roots in the 19th century, where the whole Darwinian ideas came up and became more important. And all of a sudden, we were just another animal, not this creation of God that stands out. And so different players, including the Catholic Church and so on, had to make sure that we are different from other animals. And so we would look at what does make the human. They looked at it. What makes the human human? Well, it's sight, where we can read with it. It's language, where we can talk. So it's audition. So these senses, of course, they're very developed for us humans, but these senses were the senses that we distinguish ourselves from the animals. And the other senses where animals may be outperforming us, well, these are then lower senses. The consequence of this is that we A, thought this is a lower sense, and B, this is less important for us. But as a secondary result of this is that we as mankind would put much less effort into understanding how the sense of smell works, because that's something that was reserved for rats and dogs and other species like this.
Right. So less research dollars and so on, when it's yet still so fundamental to being human. There was a really interesting study with graduate students, I think, who are given a choice between their sense of smell and their phones or something like this. Maybe just tell us what that study was about.
I think it was Rachel Hertz who did this study where graduate students were asked what they would give up for some item. So it was shown that they would be very hesitant to give up a vision for their cell phone. If they had to choose between keeping their cell phone and keeping the vision, then they chose vision. But if they got the option to give up smell or the cell phone, then the choices were quite different. And the participants were quite ready to give up the sense of smell. This is one study, but this is consistently found when we ask people what is the most important sense and which is the least important sense, which one would you give up if you had to, and so on. The sense of smell always comes up last. I think this may change a little bit. This may have changed with the context of COVID, as we already discussed, where beforehand, people that have lost their sense of smell, they really were exotic. Nobody talked about it, although it's very widespread. But if somebody said, I cannot smell, then the other said, well, you're lucky you can't smell the people in the bus or diapers or whatever. But I think there was all of a sudden much more awareness how important it is to have a good sense of smell. And now, of course, this audience knows it very well. But I think this is a common misconception that the sense of smell is less important than it actually is for us. Because it's not just smelling flowers and so on, because the sense of smell has much more implications. And I'm sure we will be talking about that as well.
Absolutely. I'm fascinated with this. Even in something like as simple as a tomato, there are 200 odors. We're going to get into this. So first, though, let's walk through how smell works. You started on this, but what's the basic anatomy from odor molecules in the wine glass? How do they get up to our brain?
So first, we need to have an odor source in which the odor molecule is stored. So this can be a liquid like wine. This can be a solid substance. This can be gas. From this odor source, the odor molecules have to reach the air. So they have to be volatiles. And they can reach the air either by evaporation or because it is heated up or whatever. Then they are in the air surrounding our body. They can be also inside our body if they are in the mouth. And as we breathe in, actually what happens is I contract the muscles of my diaphragm and I create a vacuum or under pressure in my lungs, and then air is sucked in to counter that. And if my mouth is closed, the air goes through my nose. And with this air, all the molecules that are found in the air, and not just the odor molecules, also viruses and bacteria and dust and whatever, will come into our nose, will be filtered. And the odor molecules will reach the upper portion of the nasal cavity, really the roof of the nasal cavity. And in this portion of the nasal cavity, we have a specific epithelium. We have specific cells in the mucosa. And these cells, the odor receptor cells, have on their surface receptors, olfactory receptors. If the odor molecules fit to this olfactory receptor, then something happens in the chain, in the cell, a chain reaction of things happen. And the end result of that is that the so-called action potential, an electrical signal, is created in the olfactory receptor cell. And this electrical signal is then conveyed via the olfactory nerve into the brain, into the olfactory bulb that's located above our eyes, between our eyes and above it. And from there, then we have different other processing steps until the information, now this is now an electrical information, this is not the odor molecule anymore, will then reach the centers of the brain that are responsible for processing and for perception of olfaction.
Wow. And what about the trigeminal nerve? Is it involved in this smell and wine tasting?
So per se, smelling is limited to what I just said. Of course, the odor molecules that we have, and not just the other molecules, other things that we could find in there, they may stimulate other receptors of our body, other organs of our body. And for example, if we have wine in our mouth, the same thing happens that I just said before. So volatiles will come out of the liquid and then be in the air and reach the nasal cavity. But of course, also the liquid in the mouth will stimulate the receptors in the mouth, the gustatory receptors. So it will be sour, it will be sweet. But it will also stimulate the alcohol, for example, has a smell, but the alcohol will also activate other receptors that are located on the trigeminal nerve. So they per se have nothing to do with the sense of smell. They will then be perceived as stinging. Like, for example, if you have a glass of cognac in front of you and you take a sniff, you can clearly perceive the stinging of the alcohol. But this is another nerve, because usually we experience smell and this stinging or tickling or burning or cooling or whatever. We perceive them together. And so they are processed in the same areas of the brain and they kind of belong together. So if you have a very strong wine with, 15% or something, you will perceive, on the one hand, the flavors from the wine, but we also will perceive the alcohol, the smell of the alcohol, but also the very distinct sensation, trigeminal sensation of the alcohol. And this will all be processed together and belongs together because the flavor perception is the ensemble of the perceptions of the sensations that we have during perception of something in our mouth.
And the trigeminal nerve, is it along our jawline or back under our ears? Where is that?
The trigeminal nerve is a so-called somatosensory nerve. So that's the nerve that is responsible for the innervation of the skin of our face, also of the mucosa. So if you touch your forehead or if you hit your jaw, then the perception that you have is from this trigeminal nerve. So it's responsible for the innervation of the skin, also of the mucosa. If I touch your tongue, you perceive this with the trigeminal nerve. If you go to the dentist, he will freeze either one branch, the lower branch or the middle branch of the trigeminal nerve so that he can do his whatever he wants to do on your teeth or whatever he has to do. So that's all the trigeminal nerve. But this trigeminal nerve, as I said, is also responsible for the mucosa, so for the insides, also for the eye, and allows us to perceive pain, but also allows us to perceive tickling, burning, freshness, cooling, spiciness, and all these different kind of perceptions.
Wow. Fascinating. And that sort of explains why when we have a stuffy nose, we lose our sense of taste. So flavor, I think you've already alluded to this, is not those 5 basic tastes in our mouths. It's the combination of taste and smell working together, right?
Exactly. So in the everyday language, there's often a misconception between flavor and taste. So from a neurophysiological point of view, and I guess it's also from the point of view of wine connoisseurs, the taste is actually only sweet, sour, bitter, and salty. So this is perceived via the sense of taste. Different nerves, again, different receptors. They're located mainly on the tongue, in the papilla of the tongue. Then we have the smell perception that takes place via the olfactory nerve, as I explained before. Then we have trigeminal perception. It's again a different nerve. And then we have other perceptions such as the texture, the coolness, the warmth. We feel liquid, we feel the crunchiness of something. We even hear what's going on in our mouth. We see what we are eating and so on. And all these different sensory modalities together form a unique perception in our brain. And this is flavor perception. So we cannot really completely discriminate or separate them from each other, because what happens in the brain is that these informations that come from different sensory channels are all put together, are processed in overlapping brain areas, and then this unique perception is created. So if you eat a pineapple, for example, you will have sweetness and sourness from the pineapple. You have the aromas from the pineapple. You feel cooling, you feel the acidity that maybe stings a little bit, and so on. And all this together gives you the flavor of a pineapple. So the flavor of a pineapple is all these sensations together.
Wow. So correct me if I'm wrong, but humans have about 400 types of scent receptors. Dogs have closer to 1,000. So what do dogs experience in terms of scent that we can't? And is there anything we can learn wine-related from that?
So yes, you're right. We have approximately 400 different olfactory receptors, but this number is not exactly 400. Maybe you have 420 and I have only 380, and the 380 that I have don't overlap completely with the 420 that you have. So already from that perspective, our olfactory world is a little bit different. To make this understandable, let's look at the different sense. Let's look at the sense of vision. In vision, we have 4 different receptors. We have 1 receptor for black and white, and then we have 3 receptors for colors, 1 for red, 1 for green, 1 for blue. And with these 4 different receptors, we are able to see all the beauty of the rainbow and the spring and the fall and whatnot. There are some people amongst us that do not have 4 receptors, they only have 3. They are missing 1 of those receptors. Typically, it's the red receptor. And so they have a hard time distinguishing red and green. And red and green both look for them a little bit grayish. If somebody is colorblind, as this condition is called, it's very difficult for them to imagine how red and green would look like. And the same is for us who are not colorblind. If we have 4 receptors, imagine if we would have a 5th receptor. Some birds have a 5th receptor. How the world would look different. We have no idea. We cannot imagine these additional colors. Now imagine for the sense of smell, we don't have 5 or 6, we have 400. So the dimensionality of our perception is just extremely more vast. But it's even more so for dogs. As I said, you have maybe 420 and I have 380. So already on that level, your olfactory world would be more complex and would be definitely be different than mine. But the one of dogs and rats and mice that have way more receptors than we have must be so much more complex, but it's not conceivable for us. So just like we cannot imagine additional colors to the one that we already see.
Is it true, or am I referring to some other sort of science? Do women tend to have more scent receptors than men, or is that taste buds?
It is not so much that women have more receptors than men. This is pretty equal, the number of receptors. Nevertheless, women usually outperform men in smell tests. Or let's put it differently. It's not always that we find sex differences, but if we find sex differences, then usually female participants outperform the male participants. Why this is like this, we do not know. Has it something to do with really the olfactory apparatus being better performing in female versus male? Or is it that women have superior language abilities that is known, and the outcome could be influenced by that because, often these are odor identification tests. And so you have to match a label to the odor. And if you have superior language skills, then this task would be more easily performable. Or has it something to do with hormones because the difference tends to disappear after menopause, or other factors add to those? So it's not entirely clear why this is like this. It could be also a cultural phenomenon. So you may have noticed that I use male and female and men and women interchangeably. We do not know if it's related to sex or gender because it could be also a cultural phenomenon, because in our societies, women assign a more important role to olfaction. It's typically the mother who is responsible for preparing food, who's responsible for the hygiene of the family, for washing and so on. And this may be then, already given on to young girls and young women, that they are just more interested in that. I can see that in my research. I'm in the Department of Anatomy, and I have a colleague who works on spinal cord injury. And when I look for graduate students, 90 to 95% of the candidates are women, and only few men are there. And at my colleagues, 90 to 95% of the people that are interested in that topic are men, and there's nearly no woman participating. So it's clearly that olfaction seems to be more attractive to women as a subject. When we look for participants for our studies, we always have a much easier time to find women than men. So I think that the topic of smell seems to be more interesting for women than for men. Why this is like this, we do not know. Where does it start? Where does it end? That we don't know. But typically, to come back, if we find a difference in smell tests between the sexes, it's typically the women that perform better than the men.
Fascinating. And certainly just my perception is that the market for perfume is far larger for women, the brands and variations, than it is for men.
Exactly.
So are we better at smelling wine than dogs? Is there something going on there?
This is a very, very interesting and fascinating question. So we just discussed that dogs have so much more receptors than humans, and they also outperform us in many tasks, right? We don't hire a human to sniff around at the airport. We have dogs to do that. Again, it's not all dogs that can do that. And we humans, we can also train different things. We can follow a trace of odors on a field. From body odors, we can recognize if somebody is healthy or sick, if somebody is a man or a woman, if somebody is older or young, just as dogs, not as highly performing. But the big difference, if we talk about the receptors, of course, dogs have way more receptors than we have. But the receptors is not the whole story. Because as I said before, the information is then passed on to the olfactory bulb and then to the brain. And in the brain, it's further processed. And we humans, we have one thing that is particularly big and performing in our body, and that's our brain. We have, compared to most other animals, a very big brain, a very high-performing brain. So even if we get less information from the receptors, because we have less receptors, our brain is much more performing and can do much more with this sparse information compared to dogs. We can talk about odors to each other. You can learn something from what I tell you. Dogs do not have this kind of abilities. And it has also been shown that with regards to odors that are related to fermentation, so that's interesting in the context of wine, we humans are particularly sensitive. This maybe have an evolutionary advantage. Imagine our ancestors walked through the savannah. The last antelope has been a while, and there is a tree far down with semi-ripe fruits or ripe fruits. It was important for our ancestors to be able to smell, are these fruits ripe? If they fall down, if they start to ferment, then it becomes interesting for us. We are very sensitive to these kind of odors, much more sensitive than carnivores that couldn't care less about an apple or something like that. So we have less receptors, but we have a better performing brain, and we can use the information that we get and we can really apply it. And over the history of mankind, we have developed so many techniques to process our food. Fermentation is just one of it. Fermentation of grapes, of course, but fermentation of wheat for beer, fermentation of milk to cheese. We have developed different cooking techniques from braising to grilling to steaming to whatever. This is all be done so that we can not only process the food, but also that we can take way more out of the food that we are ingesting. And on the way to this, we have developed also these abilities, sensory abilities with regard to these items that I just said. And wine is, of course, the most prominent of that, where we have developed really superior things. So a dog could never replace a sommelier.
I always wondered why there weren't dog sommeliers.
Yes, because we have to have so much information that is very human related to those abilities that the dog is probably would be better in detecting if there's a cork smell in the wine than we are, but that's not the only thing a sommelier does.
For sure, absolutely. And the dog would also have problems ordering from wineries, and there'd be a lot of complications for the dog.
Yes.
But anyway, so we have on average, maybe say 400 scent receptors, but we can smell or detect more than 1 trillion different odors. How do we get that many odors from so few receptors?
Again, let's look at the analogy of color. We have 3 receptors for color, but we cannot just see 3 colors. We can see a multitude of colors because we can mix those together. And the receptors that we have, they do not respond to individual odors. So we do not have a vanilla receptor and a rose receptor and a jasmine receptor, because if that were the case, we would indeed only be able to smell 400 different things. But our sense of smell doesn't work like this. These receptors do not respond to individual odors, but they rather respond to so-called functional groups in the odor molecules. So in order to understand it, every odor at the basis is a chemical substance. And if we have, let's say, the odor of coffee, there is 200, 400 different chemical substances in this smell. And each chemical substance has a chemical formula that has some characteristics. And for example, it can be a sulfur somewhere in the chemical formula, it can be an alcoholic functional group, or it can be a double bound, or something like that, a certain carbon chain length, and so on. And our sense of smell, the receptors that we have, they do respond to the presence or not of these physical chemical characteristics of the chemical structures. This means that every odorant that contains, let's say, a sulfur atom in its chemical formula will activate the receptor that responds to this sulfur component, and so on. And basically, we experience our world in 400 different dimensions. This is a little bit simplified, but basically, our apparatus says, of those 400 different things that I'm looking out, are they present or not in the ensemble of odorants that are entering the nose? And this information is then conveyed on to the brain and is then further processed. And this means that if we have odors that are chemically very similar, they will have a quite similar smell. But that's not the whole story. We also have chemicals that are not very similar from a chemical point of view, but they still smell the same. And that means we do not have complete understanding of how our sense of smell works. And this is also something that's quite puzzling. For vision, we know for 150 years what are the underlying principles of visual perception. And for hearing, it's also 100 years. For smelling, we lack 100 years behind compared to those other senses. And we have not even understood some of the basic principles of how our sense of smell works. So if we now create a new substance in a, let's say, chemical factory, and this substance is not too big, it's not too small, we can now predict that it has a smell, but we cannot predict what will it smell like. We do not know that yet.
Wow, so much. It's exciting, the potential there for people like you in that field.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
Yes.
Wow. So why are wine aromas or aromas in general so vivid? They can evoke these memories. You talked about going right back to your childhood for those seasonal smells. Why is smell much more powerful than, say, sight or audition?
Before, when I explained how the information is processed, at some point the information will come to the brain, and this then process will become conscious of what's going on. The regions of the brain that are responsible for olfactory processing belong to the limbic system. And these regions of the brain, and that's an exception of the brain, they are not just responsible for olfactory processing, of the processing of smell stimuli, they're also responsible for other functions of the brain, such as emotions, memory, learning, reward. All these functions are processed in the same areas of the brain. And that's an exception, as I said. For example, in vision, it's the occipital cortex that's responsible for visual processing. This cortex, this part of the brain, does not do anything else, just processing of visual information. And so we're very good at it. There's a huge chunk of our brain is reserved for that. But for the sense of smell, it is different. It is part of the limbic system. So when we smell something, the centers of the brain that are responsible for smell processing, but that are also responsible for memories, for emotions, or for reward, are activated by this smell stimulus. And just like we remember a very emotional situation much easier than a very boring one, also a smell can activate those centers, and a smell can trigger memories that have been created in the moment when we smelled this odor that were often emotional and that we remembered. So when we then smell this odor, then the memory to this event will be triggered. And what triggers these odors is very individually different from one person to the next. It could be something for you, it could be something else for me. For me, for example, it's burnt rubber. When I was a child, 8 years old, we had somebody lit a car in our backyard. The guy was never found, but I woke up in the middle of the night from, the light from the firefighters and the sounds and the smells. And I was not scared that night. I found it more fascinating for an 8-year-old boy. It's great. The firefighters are there. There's action in the middle of the night. Everybody's awake. So it was very exciting for me. But when I smell burnt rubber today, then I'm directly brought back to this moment. I do not have this effect when I see firefighters or when I hear them or even if I see a fire. This does not have the effect on me. But every time I smell burnt rubber, sure enough, I will be back 8 years old looking down to this burning car. And the underlying principle is the anatomical identity of the regions that are involved that are responsible for smell processing, memories, and for emotions.
I can so relate. Like anytime, this is going to sound weird, but anytime I smell a National Geographic magazine, I'm right back in my grandfather's veranda because I just love the sun was coming in. I'm smelling the magazines, couldn't kind of read them, and I remember him and the fond memories of summer. And it's the weirdest thing. So I love sniffing magazines. Kind of strange. Yeah.
This makes it also so difficult to study all this because the odors that are responsible for this Proust phenomenon in all of us are different. For me, I happen to also like that smell, but not everybody has the same reaction to these odors. And it's extremely difficult to afterwards find the precise odors that are responsible for these memories.
Yeah, they're so individual. The limbic system reminds me of an apartment with 4 roommates, whereas whatever that cortex, that processing site, that's like a single dwelling home. Like it's just focused on one thing.
I also think the limbic system is roommates that hang out together, do a lot of things together, they mix up between them, whereas the visual system is more like an office building. Everybody has his office and walks out and walks in and does not have too much interaction with the other ones around.
That's right.
But another consequence of this, the limbic system is very poorly related to our language areas. So we have a hard time describing our emotions. We also have a hard time describing smells. So it's really something that is difficult for us. It's much different for a visual input. And this also means that we can modulate much more easily with the expectations. I did studies on that. We can create an expectation, and this can then modulate the olfactory perception that we have. We did this with Parmesan cheese, where we gave our participants Parmesan cheese to smell and told them this is Parmesan cheese. And they liked it, and they said they would eat something like this. And later on, we came back with the same smell, but we told them now this is dried vomit. And they said, yeah, this is dried vomit. This is gross, would never eat something like this. But it was Parmesan cheese. And we can do this with smells. We cannot do this with images. I cannot tell you this is now an image of Parmesan cheese and show you Parmesan cheese. You say, yeah, I see this is Parmesan cheese. And later on say, this is dried vomit. And you say, no, I can see this is Parmesan cheese. So it's much more modulable and it's much more difficult to describe. And what sommeliers have the ability to do is to have a common language for the smell perceptions that they have. I'm a wine lover. I'm not at all a specialist. And I can sit with my friends and we drink a good bottle of wine. And then we start to freely associate. This is vanilla or tobacco or berries or barrique or whatnot. And all of us are right because I can say it reminds me of vanilla and nobody can say you're not right. But what the sommeliers are able to do is that they smell the wine, they taste the wine, they can then use precise descriptors that another sommelier that went through the same school is able to pick up and can understand how this wine smells and tastes like without having to taste this wine. And this is what they are training. And this is what the sommelier training is really all about, that they are getting better in describing odors and not so much that they get more sensitive to odors.
Right. So more precise universal language that is consistent.
Exactly.
If we want to become better tasters and smellers, I would think pay attention to the smells in your life. Like when you cut open vegetables or fruits, they're more pungent. But do those Vendée kits help? Like they sell the vials, little essences of cinnamon and whatever, and you sniff and then you try to find it in the wine. Do you think those really help us?
So we have done different studies, not with those ones, but we have done different studies with people who have lost their sense of smell, COVID or other viral infections. We have done studies with students that have a normal sense of smell, young people. We have done studies with sommelier students, and we have done studies with master sommeliers, so high-end sommeliers. And in all these studies, people did olfactory training, and in all these studies, their sense of smell got better. And in all these studies, we also saw effects on the structure of the brain. But what is the key takeaway here is that you have to do something that is challenging for the individual in question, which means that if we take people that have lost their sense of smell and do a smell training where they basically smell 4 different odors and just try to smell, do I smell something? Do I perceive something? Yes or no? That is challenging for them because they can't smell or they can smell very little. And this is useful for them. With the students that we tested, we cannot do this kind of training because it would not help them. They need something that is challenging for them, appropriate for them. For the sommelier students, we did not formally train them, but they got the training during their 1.5 years of training. And the same as the master sommeliers. They exercise themselves, they train themselves, but it has to be always something that is challenging. It is like when you do sports, you go to the gym. If somebody's a newbie, well, 15 minutes on the bike will be enough to get some training effect. If somebody runs a marathon every other week, 15 minutes on a bike won't have any effect on them. And it's the same for the brain. And what we can train most about smells is really, if we described the olfactory apparatus before, is the brain. So what we can train most is the connection with the language. And so I think what is extremely important is that we talk about the smells, that we communicate, that we exchange with each other, that we see what do you think, what do I think. So it's not enough to just be at home, watch TV and have odors go by, a conveyor belt of odors. That would probably not have a huge effect, but you have to actively try to work with the odors. And working is smelling, trying to do tasks, trying to talk about it, get feedback. And I think that is what really helps and what can make our sense of smell better.
Yes, I've heard that it's not just paying attention, it's actually saying it out loud really helps. Like it's probably activating different types, maybe even writing it down might be a different mode and really trying to cement in, okay, that's cinnamon, that kind of thing. And I think you alluded to this, but have there been studies that show that the brains of well-trained sommeliers are more active or more developed in this capacity?
Yes, indeed. We did this with the master sommeliers where we looked at the different regions of the brain. Now, they are quite difficult to get a grasp, and we were able to include, I think, 13 of them. Is a study that we did in Las Vegas, because I didn't know that, but there's a lot of master sommeliers in Las Vegas, and we were able to have everybody, all the master sommeliers of Las Vegas, participate in that study. So we looked at their brain, and what we saw is that one region of the brain, the entorhinal cortex, which is part of the limbic system, which is also mainly responsible for memory, the surface of the brain in this specific area, in the master sommeliers got bigger the longer they had been working, the older they were. Usually, the older we get, the thinner the cortex gets. We lose gray matter, we lose neurons during our life. But in these master sommeliers, we had the inverse effect. They got thicker. So it looks like the job that they're doing, their profession that leads them to smell very actively, to work with the sense of smell, to memorize odors, to memorize other things, makes it in a way that the cortex in these areas of the brain gets thicker with age and not thinner. So that's extremely interesting. That means that we have probably some plasticity in the brain, but it also leads us to the question, does that also mean that because the limbic system is not just responsible for smelling, but also to emotions and responsible for memory, do they also have better memory? Do they have a better memory when they're older? Are they more protected from dementia? Are they more protected from Alzheimer's disease? Are they more protected from, let's say, depression, something that is related with emotions? So these are questions that we do not have the answers to yet. It's also quite difficult to study from a scientific perspective, but something that I would definitely want to look at.
Yeah, absolutely. And is there some sense that it would be good to have these smell tests as regularly as we have eye exams so that perhaps they could be predicting if we're susceptible to getting Alzheimer's or Parkinson's?
I don't think we are there yet because it's also quite time consuming, it's costly, and the benefit of having smell exams is relatively limited, especially because we can do afterwards. If somebody can't see well, we can put glasses on. If somebody doesn't hear well, we have aids. With the sense of smell, we are not there yet. It's also the smell impairment gives us information about the state of the brain with regards to some medical conditions, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, and so on. But also there, we do not have yet interventions that actually allow us to say with confidence, it would be good to do that now. So I think we're going in this direction. And I think that the sense of smell will just become more and more important, and we will be more and more aware of the implications of all of this. But we need to do more research.
Excellent. All right. And so, how do emotional states like stress or relaxation influence our ability to perceive scent? I'm assuming if we're stressed, we're not smelling as much, or are we hypercritical aware of scents?
I mean, there is no straightforward connection there. There is indirect connections. I would say first and foremost, if we're focusing on something, well, we don't focus on something else. So we would have a harder time probably focusing on smells. It may be also that when we are stressed that we breathe differently, and breathing is an integral part of the olfactory processing cascade. So generally speaking, it's not that there is a direct link there. But like with sound, if you go for visual testing, you don't have something going on in the background while you're trying to read the letters. I have good eyesight, so I do not know exactly what happens when you go to eye test. Or when you have a hearing test, you try to do that in a calm environment. And the same is with smelling. You try to make it in a way that the person is able to focus on what's going on. And if you have something else in your mind, then you will be just absent-minded and you probably won't be able to perceive and especially appreciate to that degree. For us, smelling is difficult. We can oversee a visual scenery very fast, and we look. I can see there. This is my wife, and I can see her down there, and we can focus. With smelling, we don't have these abilities. When we try to find something in let's say an olfactory scenery, it is much more work for us to detect these kind of things, and we have to concentrate, have to focus. We don't do it a lot, so you need to have the mental spare time or spare place to do that kind of thing.
Right, right. Picture's worth 1,000 words, but a scent is, I don't know, worth 1 word, 2 words, or something. It's a lot harder. And can you discuss the role of pheromones in human olfaction, whether they play a part, say, if we're tasting wine?
Yeah, I mean, the basic question is, do we have pheromones? Do we humans have pheromones? And so far, the research has not been able to identify any substance that could be classified as a pheromone. We have also not observed any mechanism, any phenomenon that could be explained by pheromones. In other words, this is the strongest no that the scientists could say. We don't know, maybe we find at some point, but so far, in layman's term, humans do not have pheromones.
Just animals?
Not all animals. Some animals have, also some mammals. But in humans, we have not found anything. It's probably also linked to the fact that we have this huge brain. Pheromones are monomolecular substances produced by one individual of a species, received by a second individual of the same species, that evokes a very stereotypical reaction in this second individual. And in humans, we do not have stereotypical reactions. We can react even to the most unpleasant stimuli, pain. We can react differently. Some people hate pain, some people love pain. As we can see, people run marathons, or people use very spicy food, or people like certain kinds of sex that involves pain. So even this very, very fundamental negative stimulus, pain, in humans does not evoke a stereotypical reaction, and even less so chemical substances. So if we look at this definition that I just gave you of pheromones, there is this stereotypical reaction that probably in humans does not exist, and therefore we do not have substances that fulfill these criteria, and therefore we probably do not have pheromones in humans. Even if we had pheromones, they would probably mostly influence our interpersonal behavior. That could be sexual, between a man and a woman, or between man and man and a woman and women. But, that's not all the pheromones we know from the animal kingdom. There's also pheromones between mother and the child, and newborn, and so on, and other actions. But we do not have anything. And so therefore, the influence on the wine and tasting and wine perception is certainly limited, or at all absent.
Okay, cool. This may or may not be related, but there was a study, maybe you did it, I'm not sure, but the sweaty t-shirts and horror movies, what was going on there?
Yeah, so basically, I talked about pheromones a lot, and I said that probably we do not have pheromones. But this does not mean, I don't want to say that we don't influence each other via our body odors. We do influence each other. This can go in many, many directions. And one of these directions is that we also convey information about our emotional state. The basic emotions that we have, like fear and joy and anger and disgust. So we can transport them via our body odor. We don't do that consciously. We don't perceive that consciously, but it influences us. And one of the studies, there were people that were parachuting for the first time. Of course, it's something extremely stressful. They're really frightened. They're very scared. And the researchers gave them t-shirts in which they put some breastfeeding pads under the armpits so that they would collect the sweat of the people. And so they came down. Everybody was okay afterwards. But they had, of course, been very, very scared. These breastfeeding pads were collected, and the odors in these breastfeeding pads, so the air was streaming over it, was presented to people that were watching horror movies. People, they didn't know what they were exposed to. They didn't know what this was, the smell was there. They did not even perceive a smell, but they experienced the horror movie as much more scary than when they were exposed to breastfeeding pads of people that had been to the gym. So they had been sweaty too, they had been smelly too, but there is something in the smell, and we don't know what it is. We don't know if it's a molecule, if it's a combination of molecules, but that conveys this information. On an anecdotal note, I'm, as I said, a professor for anatomy, so at the end of the semester we have anatomy exams, and that's something where students are usually also very scared. And I have the impression, and I don't know, this is not scientific, when I enter the room and I see those students, I have the impression that I can smell their fear, even, as I said, if this is not scientific.
Well, maybe you're sending out other orders like relax, relax, you'll be okay.
I'm trying to also to relax them by dropping a couple of jokes, but usually that doesn't work that well. I have learned it's not the moment.
Is it true we have something like 120 odors that comprise our body odor?
We don't know. That's the short answer. We have sweat glands all over our body. We have on our hands and our face and so on. And most of those glands, they produce only water and salt. And they help us to regulate the temperature and maybe also the salt homeostasis. But we have some areas of the body in the armpit, in the anogenital region, where we have another type of glands. And these glands, they do not just produce water and salt, they also produce a cocktail of substances. The composition of this cocktail is individually different. And it's this cocktail of substances that creates the very distinct body odor that each and every one of us has. But it's very difficult to measure, and it's very difficult to pinpoint what is actually the component that makes us smell. In addition, this cocktail of substances is influenced by what we eat. So if we eat garlic, we smell garlic. If we eat curry, we smell curry. It depends on our hygiene, if we shower every day, or if we shower every 5 hours, or if we shower once a week. It depends on the bacteria we have on our body that then metabolizes whatever comes there. It depends on the detergents that we use for laundry and so on, of the perfumes we put on and so on. So when we perceive the body odor of somebody else, and also we perceive different parts, we perceive it, but not necessarily consciously, but it's this cocktail of substances that is modulated and metabolized and so on that then creates this. It's also when two people come closer to each other, let's say from a office mate to a intimate sex partner, of course, you come in contact much closer in different contexts, and the perception will also change, and the substances that we are exposed to. So it is not easy. We cannot say we have 100, we have 120. There's many, but it's also different from one person to the next. And there's other stuff that is going on the surface of our skin.
Oh, so complex. Great. And so when we come back to wine aromas, do we process those differently in our brain from synthetic, artificial scents like perfumes or air fresheners?
The thing is, at the basis, all smells are chemical substances. So from that perspective, there is no difference. However, there is a difference. And the difference is the following. If a company tries to recreate, let's say, the smell of onions for potato chips, we can use actual onions and roast them. And then we have probably 200, 250 different molecules in this that we could then use on a spice or something that we put on the chips. Or we could see which are the most dominant of these molecules, which are the ones that are in the highest concentration, and do they smell like onion? Then I take the top 4 and put them on it. And it's probably enough to create the sensation of an onion. So both will smell like onion, but it's not the same composition. So it cannot be excluded that this is perceived quite differently. And we all know that there is some artificial smells and flavors, and there is some that are more natural. And the artificial ones are typically way stronger, but it's due to what I just explained. There's usually just 2-3 substances that are used that are enough to make a candy smell like apple, but it is not the same thing as in the real apple, because in the real apple we have all these different odors. So that's one thing. The other thing is that when we have artificial scents, we often tend to have less, but also in higher concentrations. But because, if you make 5 or 10%, does not make a big difference anymore. So then that you have much stronger odors. And this is a little bit the tricky issue with olfactory marketing, for example, that is used by some companies, by hotels, by boutiques, clothing chains, and so on. But it could be attractive to some, but it could be very repellent for other people. And so you have to find the right balance to say, okay, I attract the people that I want to have here, and I don't care about the rest, but you have to find the right level. Olfactory marketing, again, if you have a bakery from the 19th century, it smells wonderful of bread, that's probably the best marketing that you could have. So to come back to the question that you had about the wine, in wine, there is also, and I'm not a specialist of this, there is a multitude of substances that is in there, and it's really in the ensemble of these substances that create the very distinct flavor that we perceive. Again, by the sense of smell, it's the most important one, but then we also have the sense, we have all the other ones, taste and trigeminal and texture and whatnot, that adds, and they then allow us to have the complete appreciation of the flavor.
Right. Yeah, no, it's interesting. You mentioned olfactory marketing, and I'm just reading lately that certain hotel chains have a certain smell. I guess they're putting it on the sheets, and even the maids who are cleaning the rooms are wearing outfits that have this signature smell.
Yes. The idea is clear. They try to create these olfactory memories and a distinct signature. But you have to be careful. It's not, it's not straightforward.
Turn off some people. Yeah,
exactly.
I think there's even, is it Lowe's or one of the hardware stores deliberately uses fresh cut wood, and yet there's no wood being cut in the store, but they're putting it into the store just so you get that smell. It's fascinating. And retronasal, we touched on it, but going back to that, is that after you taste the wine, heat it up, swallow it, and you breathe back through your nose? Is that the heated up molecules? Is that what retronasal?
It's not only when you swallow it. When you have it in the mouth, when you watch a sommelier, and probably you do it too, if you take a sip and then you make all these movements with your tongue, with your palate, and so on to really appreciate. But by doing that, all the molecules will already be pushed into the nasal cavity, and you will already have the perception of the olfactory component, the retronasal component. You can test that by just pinching your nose. If you pinch your nose while you do that, you don't perceive anything. Because even if it's just blocked in the front, the air cannot enter because there's already air in there. And then as soon as you release the nose, then you will have this additional dimension and you will really perceive it. So the sense of smell, retronasal olfaction, is really the key player when it comes to flavor perception.
Wow. Sure. So we talked about improving our sense of smell, the pathology of smell, being able to detect certain diseases we talked about. Maybe just talk about synesthesia, where people see colors or shapes when smelling wine. Is that just a cross-modal, cross-wiring that's happening in the brain?
So it's not entirely clear what synesthesia is exactly. It's also not entirely clear how common this condition is. You have those very extreme cases of people, really having one modality activated and they have a very clear perception in another one. But we can all be a little bit synesthetic. If I ask you which of those two sounds is sharper, is it bom bom or kek kek kek? You probably would say kek 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 is sharper. So sharp, it has nothing to do with the sounds that I just made. This is a touch description, but we use it for that. So I think to some extent, we are all a little bit synesthetic because we use these cross-modal, or we perceive cross-modally similar things, but then you have the extreme where people really have a taste and say, this is blue. I have a regular student, a very good student, that said, yeah, he's a synesthete, and for him is the days of the week they have clear colors. So Wednesday is yellow and the Thursday is green or something like that. And I thought, wow, this is really interesting. I asked somebody in the lab, we have 12 people in the lab, and said, oh yeah, I have that too. So apparently this is a quite common condition. But I think what you're referring to is really these extreme cases of synesthetics, where we have this very strong, not just perceptions, or the cross-modal perceptions, the topic is very fascinating, is also very difficult to study, because what we try to do when we study something is we try to group people together so that we can compare one group with another group. The thing with synesthesia, it's extremely individual. Some people have a synesthesia with this and some have it with something else. This makes it, again, very difficult to study, to understand exactly what's going on. But what we think, the idea is that when we are born, a lot of the brain areas are interconnected with each other, that these connections are not used later in life, and then they're pruned away. We don't need them, so we don't use them, and so these connections are not existing anymore. This is part of the maturation of the brain, and it seems that in some people, these connections do not disappear and keep staying there. And this would explain why, when you have a visual input, why this would then activate auditory or olfactory sensation at the same time.
Wow. And then back to COVID, recovery, is it just a matter of genetics? I mean, you're trying to help people recover by getting them to smell things, so maybe that's part of it. But in the end, whether people get their sense of smell back due to an illness, is that just genetics?
We do not know. We know anosmia and hyposmia, so the absence of the sense of smell and the reduced sense of smell, that existed already before COVID. And it's quite common. It's like 1 in 5 can either not smell at all or smell less. In some of the people, the sense of smell can come back, so it can recover. The factors that influence recovery that are known are 3. First one is the cause of the olfactory dysfunction. So people that lost their sense of smell due to a viral infection of the upper respiratory tract, such as COVID or the flu or something like that, they have a higher probability to regain their sense of smell compared to people with a traumatic brain injury, concussion. The second is the age. Younger people have a higher probability to recover their sense of smell compared to older ones. And the third one is the time, the interval since the loss of sense of smell. If you lost your sense of smell last week, it's highly probable that it will come back. If it's already 4 years, then it's much less likely that it will come back. So these are the main factors influencing olfactory recovery. Unfortunately, this is on a group level again, but we can unfortunately not predict in a specific person why the sense of smell comes back in one and the sense of smell does not come back in the other. And this is especially dramatic with COVID, because COVID is a viral infection that affected a lot of young people. Before, it was usually older people, 55 and older, that would have olfactory problems after a viral infection. With COVID, all of a sudden, we were young people. And in the acute phase, especially in the earlier variants, you would have 60-70% of the people that lost their sense of smell. Fortunately, in most of the people, the sense of smell came back, but not in all. Some it came back, did not recover completely. Some came back, but they had altered smell perception that got better after a while. It comes back every time they have a cold, it goes away again. So we do not yet know why some people have recovery and some people do not have recovery.
So much to learn. I mean, we've talked about so many areas that still need to be explored as it relates to our sense of smell. What are you most excited about? What are you working on? What are you looking forward to finding out?
In my lab, we have 2 research axes. One axis is to understand how smell testing will allow us to get more information about the brain and the health of the brain and the state of the brain. We could use that for early screening, for Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's disease, and also to see who will have a long-term consequence of a traumatic brain injury, such as depression or anxiety disorder. So that's one aspect. And the other aspect is to better understand how multisensory integration takes place with the chemical senses. How do we integrate the single sensory channels into one percept? But also we're looking into plasticity in the chemical senses. Can we train them? How does it get better? How do we improve our sense of smell? What happens with the brain if we improve our sense of smell? So that's what we are doing in the lab. I think if we look at the scientific community in general, something that is really the hot topic right now, with the advent of new tools such as artificial intelligence and so on, we will be able soon to better understand how the olfactory code works, which means basically we will be able to predict which chemical substances will have what kind of smell. And that will be interesting because we will be able to create new smells, but it will be also interesting for very distant topics such as insect repellents. Right now, we use a handful of insect repellents because we have figured out that they help, but we have no systematic approach to it. Of the millions and billions of chemical substances, we don't know which ones exist and that we could develop. We don't know which one will be active against mosquitoes, for example. And I think with these new tools, we can analyze the olfactory space with much higher efficiency, and we'll be able to develop these kind of substances. And I think this is really, we will hear in the next years a lot about these kind of stuff.
That is mind-blowing. Wow. Fantastic. As we wrap up, Johannes, if you could share a bottle of wine, you said you are an aficionado of wine, with anyone in the world, living or dead, who would that be and what would you ask them?
This is a very, very interesting question. You said it should be somebody from the wine world or from outside the wine world.
It could be anybody.
I would like to have a glass of wine with Barack Obama, with wine from my home region in Alto Adige in Italy, where there's a lot of white wine, but also quite tasty red wine, which I really appreciate. And I would like to have a chat with him and I would ask him what went wrong. But that is what I would like to have a discussion.
Well, that's a big question. That requires a whole bottle of wine, I think. Yeah. As we wrap up, be honest, is there anything we haven't covered that you wanted to mention?
Just one thing. It's not so much that we did not cover it, but I think a take-home message is that we have to talk more about smells. Smells, especially when it comes to body odor, is a taboo. We can tell a colleague you have parsley in your teeth after lunch, but we cannot tell him you smell of garlic. Everything related to body odors is a taboo, but everything with smells we have a hard time talking about. And I think the one thing that will allow us to get better with our sense of smell is to share and share verbally, to talk about smells. And this is something that can be very, very joyful. And I think wine tasting and wine drinking is one of those joyful moments where you can do it. I'm not a specialist, and so maybe I say it for myself, but I think we are all the biggest specialists of the perceptions that we have. So if we perceive something in a wine, nobody can take that away from us. If we perceive vanilla, we perceive vanilla. And even if all the others say, I don't perceive vanilla, we are right. This is something that is quite positive about sensory perception in the context of wine, that we are all the biggest specialists of our own body and of our own smell.
Absolutely. Trust yourself, and you don't always have to rely on so-called experts, wine experts for sure. It is about your own experience and interpretation. Where can people best find you online and you and your work, Johannes?
I'm in a lucky position that I have a very unique combination of a first name and last name. So if you type that in, you will pretty fast find my lab and information about myself. I am at the University of Quebec in Trois-Rivières, so if that's easier to type that into your Google, then you can go this way too. But I would be very happy to receive any kind of feedback, and who knows what kind of discussions will come out of this conversation we just had.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your time. It's absolutely fascinating. Your research is exciting for wine tasters and beyond. It's just wow, the things that are going to come out that are going to be benefiting so many people. So thank you for sharing that with us, Johannes.
Thank you very much for having me.
All right. I'll say cheers for now. Bye-bye. Well, there you have it. I hope you enjoyed our chat with Dr. Johannes Frasnelli. Here are my takeaways. Why is smell, often called the Cinderella sense, so underrated in our culture, especially when many luxury products like wine, spirits, perfume are based on it? Johannes explains that there's a myth about us not having as good a sense of smell as other animals, but this has its roots in the 19th century when Darwinian ideas emerged. Suddenly, we were just another animal and not this creation of God. So different players, including the Catholic Church, wanted to establish that we were different from other animals. So they looked at what makes us human. Well, that includes our sight, as we can read, language, because we can talk. So it's these senses that are very developed for us as humans and how we distinguish ourselves from the animals. Whereas with our other senses, like smell, animals are outperforming us. So these became deemed the lower senses and less important for us. Therefore, we have also put much less effort into understanding how the sense of smell works, because that's something that was reserved for rats and dogs and other species. I find that absolutely fascinating. Number 2, even though dogs have twice the number of scent receptors than humans, why are we better at detecting wine aromas? In the context of wine, Johannes says, humans are particularly sensitive, And this may be an evolutionary advantage. Imagine our ancestors who were walking through the savannah. It may have been quite a while since they ate, so it was important for them to be able to smell ripe, even fermenting fruit. We became much more sensitive to these odors than carnivores that didn't eat fruit. So while we have fewer smell receptors, we have a better performing brain to interpret the information that we get and apply it. That's why we have also developed so many techniques to process our food. Fermentation is just one of them, from braising to grilling to steaming. This is done so that we can get more out of food that we're ingesting. So a dog could never replace a sommelier. That's a relief, I'm sure, to many. But I wonder if a dog did become a sommelier, would it recommend real brands like Chateau La Paz and Doggone Red? Woof. Okay, moving on. Number 3, what might surprise you about how we perceive the senses of taste and smell? The central myth, Johannes observes, is that once we have something in our mouth, we talk about taste, but it's actually not taste. Most of what we're perceiving is olfaction, especially retronasal olfaction. As the molecules enter the nasal cavity from the back, through the pharynx and the throat, what we can taste, sweet, bitter, salty, sour, umami, is actually olfactory perception. Number 4, why is the sense of smell so evocative compared to other senses? Johannes explains that the regions of the brain responsible for olfactory processing belong to the limbic system, which is also responsible for other functions such as emotions, memory, learning, and reward. This mixed function is not how the rest of the brain works, as each area tends to be dedicated to one task. For example, the occipital cortex is responsible for visual processing and doesn't do anything else. So when we smell something, we are also stimulating our memories, emotions, desire for rewards, and so on. That's why we can remember something that happened years ago, because it was either associated with a certain smell or a strong emotion. Number 5, how can you train your sense of smell? Johannes explains that master sommeliers train their brain's sense of smell just like many people train physically when they go to the gym. The key is to make it challenging. If somebody is a newbie, 15 minutes on a bike will be enough to get that training effect, but not for someone who runs marathons. It's the same for our brains. What we can train most about smell is its connection with language. And that's why it's important to talk out loud about the smells we detect with each other. It's not enough just to have the odors sort of float by. You have to actively try to identify them. Number 6, why does smelling require much more focus than our other senses? Smelling is difficult for humans, Johannes observes. We can oversee a visual scene very quickly. With smelling, we don't have this ability. When we smell something in our environment, it is much more work for us to identify the particular odors, and we have to concentrate. We don't do that a lot. So you need to have the mental spare time to focus. And number 7, what is retronasal olfaction and why is it so important when it comes to enjoying wine? Johannes says that retronasal olfaction is not only when you swallow the wine, it's also when you have it in your mouth. When sommeliers swish the wine around in their mouths, the molecules heat up and get pushed up into the nasal cavity, which is also part of the retronasal component. You can test this just by pinching your nose. You won't smell because it's blocked in the front. The air can't enter. Then as soon as you release the nose, you will have this additional smell dimension. Retronasal olfaction is really the key player when it comes to smell and flavor perception. I'd love to hear your thoughts about this episode. Have you ever tried detecting wine's aromas using your retronasal olfaction? Are you surprised at just how many aromas or scents that we can detect? Is there a particular smell, whether it's wine-related or not, that immediately brings back an evocative memory for you? Email me and tell me about it at natalie@nataliemclean.com. Thank you for taking the time to join me here. I hope something great is in your glass this week. Perhaps a wine that helps you remember times past.
You don't want to miss one juicy episode of this podcast, especially the secret, full-bodied bonus episodes that I don't announce on social media. So subscribe for free now at nataliemclean.com/subscribe. Meet me here next week. Cheers.